Thanks so much for coming. My name is Claire Pershan. I'm the Mozilla Foundation's EU Advocacy Lead, and I will be moderating this session, which is titled Lifting the Hood on Big AI, the Future of Transparency and Accountability in AI. This session is about AI openness and transparency and the need for external scrutiny of the AI models impacting society. The most widely used AI models, which are increasingly being integrated right into downstream products and applications, are not particularly open or transparent about how they function. Why should they be? At the risk of being a little bit obvious, I do actually want to pause on this point for 1 minute. And I find that a lot of AI experts that talk about openness, I don't know if you find this too, but I find that they talk about cake. And I think this is quite fitting after lunch. I think maybe it has to do with the layers. But so the premise is something like this. It's that if you take a kind of off-the-shelf proprietary AI model, you might not necessarily know what's inside. If you have the recipe, if you have the ingredients, you can make it yourself or make it with your friends. You can compare cakes, find the one that is best for you. You can also just know the nutritional value of that cake, if there's anything allergic, if the cake happens to have personal data in it, right? If the cake has any security vulnerabilities, or if the cake may have used some of, some aspects, things that shouldn't be in there. So with that, this is not a new debate, the idea about tech not being always fully transparent. This is obviously not a new topic. We have almost decades now of experience of trying to look under the hood of social media companies. We also have a lot of learnings from the open source software space. And with that, I will turn over to our panelists who are not going to talk about cake, I promise. They're actually going to talk about AI. But I will introduce them each, and they will help us understand how and why we should be scrutinizing AI models. So I will work down the line. Nick Bodden is Senior Policy Associate at AWO in Brussels. He's currently working on a project on the risks associated with open release generative AI models and how to tackle those risks. Before joining AWO, he worked at Landmark Public Affairs and at the European Center for International Political Economy. Razia Bouza-Chetin is Policy and Communications Lead at AI Forensics, which is a nonprofit that investigates influential and opaque algorithms. Bouza is co-founder of AI research advocacy and art platform Dreaming Beyond AI. She was in 100 Brilliant Women in the AI Ethics 2020 list and 35 under 35 European leaders by Barcelona Center for International Affairs. Dr. Lucie Aimé-Café is applied policy researcher at Hugging Face. Hugging Face is a platform where the machine learning community collaborates on models, data sets, and applications. Driven by a commitment to community-driven decision-making, she integrates her expertise in machine learning, AI ethics, and policy to address critical societal challenges. And she's previously worked at the University of Copenhagen, University of Southampton, and HPI. And last but not least, and I will probably also mispronounce the name of, Dr. Mark Dingamansa is Associate Professor of Language and Communications at the Center for Language Studies at Radboud University, Niemen. He studies language as a form of technology with a particular interest in how interactive interfaces exploit human sense-making. And he is one of the authors of the Openness Leaderboard for LLMs, opening up ChatGPT, which you can find there at .github.io. And he's also worked on open washing in the EU AI Act. And so with that, I'll open the discussion, and I'm going to turn first, actually, to Bouza, to try to make this topic a little bit concrete and to think about what is AI openness and transparency for each of our panelists. So Bouza, can you tell us about the work that AI Forensics does, trying to, and especially maybe thinking of your recent work that's specifically on AI models?
Yes, hello. Hi everybody, this is Bouza. So as you said, when introducing me, we at AI Forensics, we're a European non-profit. We do adversarial algorithmic auditing, and we focus on influential and opaque algorithms. What does that mean? Is that in the past 6 years, and we were formerly known as Tracking Exposed, we looked at social media platforms like TikTok, YouTube, Facebook, or even e-commerce platforms like Amazon, and recently also conducted some investigations on LLMs, chatbots like Bing Chat, and now its name is Microsoft Copilot. What I mean by adversarial algorithmic auditing is that we collect our own data. We don't necessarily collaborate with the platform or have access to their data through their API, but we develop our own tools basically to for adversarial data collection, and this can be through scraping, this can be through bots and other basically methodologies and strategies that we use, and then after collecting that data, we analyze it to see what kinds of any signs of harm, discrimination, or disrespect of any regulations and obligations that platforms should abide by that are not respected, basically. And what we are trying to do is to also then work with the media in order to, garner some attention on the issue and provide evidence to regulators. And one of the examples of this was recently the formal proceedings that the European Commission launched against Meta following our study on political ads on Meta platforms, but this was also actually uncovered by other civil society organizations previously. So in a nutshell, I also like some metaphors, and I'd like to think that we're a little bit like digital detectives. Try to make it work with the cake analogy, but I'm not sure it's going to work. But what we do basically, there are different stages in the AI product lifecycle where you think about responsibility, accountability, transparency, and so on. Where we come in is like where the application, it meets the user / consumer / citizen or people, actually. And we try to kind of look at the result and understand the dynamics that we might not be able to understand, for example, through API or other things, analyze the behavior of the algorithm.
Thanks, Buse. I think it's really helpful to understand also this sort of adversarial approach, right, as we think more about different types of research. Mark, you run the leaderboard opening up ChatGPT. So I would love to ask you what inspired this project, and also how are you evaluating and how are you assessing openness and transparency?
Right, yes, indeed we do. So for us it started, I'm a scientist, I work at a university, publicly funded. And for us, it started just out of an interest in this new technology, generative AI, large language models specifically. We wanted to understand how it worked. We wanted to be able to teach our students how this technology works, to tinker with it, to really do fundamental research on these wonderful capabilities. Yet we found that most models were not really open. So we started just tracking information on the degree of openness of all these different alternatives. And I actually have a slide showing just a sample of this leaderboard so that you get a feeling for what this looks like and how many open alternatives there are to systems like ChatGPT, which everybody knows, of course. So this leaderboard, we just started looking for open alternatives. We don't really care exactly how open they are. We actually track it. So these models often claim to be open. We include every single instruction-tuned generative AI model that claims to be open, which is not to say that it actually is open. That's pretty much the question, of course. And so we focus on a bunch of dimensions. I don't think you can see the upper part of the slide here. Thank you, that's helpful. Where it actually gives you the dimensions we look at. So we look at 14 dimensions of openness from the left, looking at source code and the availability of data, to on the right, the access, like can you use a package or have an API? There's a question there. Sorry, you asked for the, yeah, there's a microphone's coming.
Sorry, I'm just a bit confused on what the definition or the meaning of openness in this regard entails.
So, there is no single definition, because the notion of openness, we believe, is gradient and composite. So it is made up of multiple parts, and it is also continuous. You cannot simply say, my system is open. In fact, you have to specify, well, what is open about it? Did you publish the source code? Do you provide information about what data went in there, what pre-training, what post-training data, how you fine-tuned it? Did you scientifically document the architecture? Do you release it under a so-called open license? So these are the 14 dimensions up there, and we basically just look at every single model that calls itself open and put it to the test. So to actually go back to the top there's some beautiful examples of really quite open models that score right across the board green, almost entirely. There are other examples that are, much less green, but better known. So if we actually scroll down again, that's where you find the big players. So you can see Llama 3 by Meta, Gamma by Google. You can see it in the foyer for yourself. It's available, it's ubiquitous, but it is not actually open. And to illustrate, to come back to the moderator's question, to illustrate why openness is important, let me just single out this Llama 3 example by Meta. Just a single cell in this graph looks at did they provide openness about the reinforcement learning data. Now that data is kind of the secret sauce that makes these models so susceptible, and nice to interact with. It makes them behave, it saves, it helps them kind of act in a safe and helpful way. Now, do we know anything about what Meta, the company, put into this model? What they say in their technical paper is they have over 1 million specified guidelines, human feedback, basically, that went into there. That's what they call the Meta reward modeling data. Huge data set, we know nothing about what's in there. This is the company that had no qualms 10 years ago experimenting on its users on Facebook. Do we really want to just put a model out there and trust it? I would want to look into those guidelines. And so that's what we test in a single cell in this matrix. Now imagine every single cell in this matrix being backed up by evidence-based statements like that. That's what we've been doing. That's what's helped us to identify some open models, identify some really excellent players. Bloom Z of the Big Science Workshop, involving also Hugging Face folks, is a beautiful example. Ellen AI, the top one here, Olmo Instruct, is also amazing, actually. We can learn from that. We can work with that as scientists. The bigger ones, all down there, they are not playing very well, and our index is actually helping us to show that.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is a really great resource. I think it's also a very existential question. What is openness, right? And with that question, also turning to Lucy, you can talk about how you feel about the ranking if you want, but I would also love to ask you, just can you share a little bit more about what is Hugging Face?
Yeah, I'll try. The microphone works? Okay, great. Do you know what Hugging Face is? Can you just show hands who knows it? Okay, great. I'll give you the explanation anyway for the 5 people who don't know yet, and also for you to see if what you think we are and what I explain overlaps, kind of. So Hugging Face is this community-oriented company. We're based in the US and France and everywhere in the world pretty much, working on democratizing good machine learning. So it has become the most widely used platform for sharing and collaborating on machine learning systems. It's open source, open science. We host machine learning models as well as data sets. We have infrastructure to analyze, deploy, and process those models as well as the data sets easily. We have educational resources. There's a whole range of tools that we're providing. But we also lead and collaborate on novel AI research and development of models. So for example, as Mark just mentioned, we have this big code project, the Bloom, first of all, which is the largest open source multilingual model. So it is a text model that works across languages. It was developed by a big community of people together. There's the big code project, where we have the StarCoder model, which is now ranked as one of the most open and most accessible models, which is also used in commercial products, which I think is always important to note also that open source doesn't mean bad, or open source doesn't mean commercially viable. And then there is Edifix, which I think which was relatively recently released, which is an open source multimodal model. So it doesn't just work on text, we work also across images, which I think is a very interesting new modality as well. And I think one thing that is important to note when we are talking about the work, and especially the model development that we're doing at Hugging Face, is that we have a value-driven approach. So that means we create ethics charters. We think about like what values do we want to work on for different projects before we start working on the models. And this is all publicly documented. So this makes us very accountable in a way as well, right? Like we not only publish those models and the evaluation and the data sets for them, we also publish intent and scope of those models for people to understand what we were meant to do. As I said, open source kind of is at the heart of the community, of the projects, and the company itself. So a lot of it is happening in this like open source space. It's visible. And I believe that when we say democratizing machine learning, that means having a diverse set of stakeholders be able to participate and contribute to machine learning, understand the models, understand the data sets, contribute to the models and data sets. And I think that sometimes when we talk about like governing machine learning, we forget that it can be also this like space of, or this source for joy or interest or curiosity of learning. And I think this is something that I'd like to contribute to our discussion a little bit, that there are wonderful moments in that, especially when a large community can come together and create a more diverse understanding of the world through models and data sets and so on. Yeah, also cool leaderboard. That's the comment in the end.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning joy, but also very much accountability, right? We mentioned transparency and openness, but these are, necessary, not sufficient. So the idea is also this will lead to accountability, and also for the idea of commercial actors as well. So Nick, you've done a lot of relevant work, but in particular, recently AWO has done an analysis for Mozilla, which is soon to be released also, which is trying to understand a piece of this openness and transparency puzzle, which is formalized researcher access programs, so closed foundation and generative AI models. So can you tell us a little bit about what programs you were looking at and what you found in that research?
Thank you, Claire, and thanks for having me. So yes, as Claire mentioned, we have been doing this research on behalf of Mozilla. I'll say off the bat, the person leading this research couldn't be here today. This is Esme Harrington, our colleague. But so this is looking at, so the goal here was to look at openness from a different side. So we were looking at closed models primarily. Like OpenAI, Google's Cohere, Anthropic, Midjourney, and Inflection. And the goal is to see how those companies involve external researchers as part of the training, the safety training of these models. And so we found a few things. So some of these companies have pre-release evaluations and red teaming that involves external researchers. So they all do pre-release evaluation and red teaming, but very few involve external researchers. So OpenAI does, Anthropic does, Inflection does as well. The problem here is that the selection process for these external programs can be quite informal, ad hoc. Most recently in 2023, OpenAI kind of formalized their approach. They have an ongoing red teaming network, which is compensated and has like a broad field of expertise. So things like cognitive science, biology, political science, anthropology even. But Anthropic and Inflection, it's a lot more limited. So like, for instance, Anthropic worked with Griffin Scientific at one point, but it was just on biosecurity. Yeah, like, and Inflection is apparently started doing something a bit like OpenAI, but it's less transparent. Then there's the post-release stuff that whereby these companies essentially subsidize external researchers to access the APIs and to be able to do safety research while the model is out there. So they use like credits, which you can use for payment for prompts for the model, and so we know that OpenAI, Anthropic, Cohere, Inflection all offer a program for researchers to apply for subsidized access to models, but the others don't. There's also in the US this program called the National AI Research Resource Pilot, NARE, where OpenAI, Microsoft, and Anthropic participate, and so this is a publicly funded intermediary which again provides subsidized access and computational resources to US-based researchers. For instance, like OpenAI donated like $1 million worth of credits for access for research purposes. Yeah, so this kind of helps highlight like, basically, if the companies aren't doing the research themselves internally, external research is expensive, right? You can't just expect that like people will be able to do the research just because you have a reasonably easy access API like OpenAI's model, OpenAI's GPT-3 or 4. And then there's like there are government mediated research institutes like the AI Research Institute, where you have, we've had commitments from OpenAI, Google, and Meta to conduct safety testing on their foundation models prior to release. The majority of these developers have failed to follow through on these commitments, instead providing model access after release, which, there's obviously a lot that happens pre-release, that's important. We also similarly, I'll correct myself there. Apparently, so Google DeepMind is apparently the only one that has allowed the UK AI Institute to do some testing on Gemini prior to release. And then finally, you have the US executive order, which saw voluntary commitments from Amazon, Anthropic, Google, Inflection, Meta, Microsoft, OpenAI. And then again, so it's commitments on a pre-release internal and external security testing. But right now, I mean, it seems like OpenAI is meeting this commitment. It's less clear than the others are. So all that to say, these companies have various programs that vary in terms of quality. It's a developing space. The landscape varies significantly. OpenAI seems to be going the furthest, but there are some issues there as well, which I can touch on later on as well.
Definitely, I'm going to ask about the issues, but that's really, a helpful overview. It seems like few and far between, but there are some programs. So turning back to you, Buse, and thinking especially also of this Copilot and Bing research, and also generally, I think it's interesting to understand how AI forensics even decides what should be the object of your research, right? So how are you picking where to do that research, and what are some of the challenges that you're facing?
Very good question. I think, as I said in the previous answer, we focus a lot on, opacity and, the algorithms being influential and impacting like a very large scale of people. But of course, there are many things that one could decide to research. There's also, we need to also think about the intersection or overlap with the regulatory agenda and what's happening and so on and so forth. But last year, for instance, although we were only doing research so far on like social media platforms, with the kind of rise in popularity of large language models and especially ChatGPT, and the statements by companies and saying that LLMs will be integrated into several products, and also seeing them being integrated on search engines, we started thinking about, okay, how these tools work and are they reliable? And this was end of 2023, and we know that this year is an election year. We have also the European elections that are coming very soon. And our Copilot or Bing Chat research that was conducted with Algorithm Watch was, I think, among the first ones to basically try to test and understand the reliability of Bing Chat or Microsoft Copilot, that works with that has access to Bing's ranking, like search engine, and also GPT. Access, I think I might maybe like talk about it in a little bit later. But what we did was that we gathered with also experts who are knowledgeable about the contextual, like local politics, and prepared some queries and prompts about the Swiss federal and German state elections in Hesse and Bavaria. We prompted the chatbot for 2 months and asked questions like things about sometimes, quite basic things actually about the election dates, about certain candidates, and so on and so forth, and analyzed the answers on information quality. And one of the findings that we found quite important and striking is that 1/3 of the answers provided by the chatbot contained factual errors. So we know that even technology companies who deploy these systems say themselves that chatbots are not reliable, LLMs are not reliable, or they may produce so-called quote-unquote hallucinations. But what is important here is that the inconsistency was very consistent in the sense that sometimes the chatbot would give evasive answers to questions about, for example, election dates. You see also different trends across languages, and maybe you would expect the quality of information to increase over time as more information was available about the elections. This was not also the case. And then we also, contacted Microsoft and tried to also conduct the same experiment 1 month later, and haven't seen a significant improvement. And another thing that was kind of quite worrying was that, Copilot cites also authoritative and resources. But for example, it would sometimes cite certain newspapers or other, resources, and then in an answer where there are factual errors. So that would also hinder the legitimacy of the sources that it would supposedly cite. And about what's important here, or when we're thinking about access, there are multiple layers to that. For example, one challenge that we faced during this specific research was basically creating accounts. Because what we do, or also other researchers, let's say that you want to investigate TikTok and you want to understand what's the impact of TikTok on teenagers' mental health. So what you do, you create bots and make sure that they simulate user behavior, let's say like a 14 years old in a given country, and try to basically collect data and analyze the behavior of the algorithm. But platforms make it difficult to create accounts, or there are quotas. You cannot, you don't have like an infinite number of prompts and queries. There are technical layers of complexity that we don't know. For example, in Copilot, how the interaction between Bing and GPT, happen. And also there is the human interaction, what we put into the system, and different levels of moderation of the prompt that somebody puts, and also the answer that you get. So all of these layers, the cake, transparency, we don't have access to, but we're trying to gather information as much as we can from an adversarial perspective to, hopefully reach to see some patterns and conclusions.
Great. Thank you for bringing back the cake. But Mark, I want to turn to you also. You've written about openness being differentiated. I think this really connects to what Buse is talking about, different levels of access. I mean, it's my understanding that this work into Copilot is essentially sampling on a large systemic scale, right? But there's so much else that needs to be understood and uncovered. So yeah, I'd love to hear about your differentiation understanding.
Yeah, that's right. So indeed, openness is differentiated. I would also like to say off the bat that openness across the board is probably not attainable, maybe not even desirable. So I want to pick on three things, three of the dimensions in our framework that are useful in this regard. First, openness, we think, is really crucial for data sets. But then I want to just specify that I don't mean by that I must be able to download your data set onto my system. I mean, this is not even possible for the sheer amount of data that goes into, say, Meta's Llama or Google's Gemma and so on. But you don't need to actually make it available for download to disclose what's in there. And to do that helps us, researchers, to understand what your model is doing, helps the public to better understand whether to be impressed with results or not. Say your LLM passes the legal bar exam. How interesting is that if there were loads of exams like that in the training data? I'm less impressed if I know that. So if you disclose your data, we know better how to interpret these models. Also key for risk analysis, for legal liability. End users actually want to know whether they risk producing text verbatim from the training data that they then might get sued for, as the New York Times has been suing OpenAI, for instance. So openness on the data set front, disclosing what went in there without necessarily making it available for download, that's key. Now, openness is actually less important, maybe surprising to say this, but it's less important, I would say, for a question like licensing. There's been a really strong lobby for open licensing to count as the factor of openness, and that lobby is partly rooted in the libertarian origins, I think, of the open source movements, where an organization like the OSI, the Open Source Initiative, that's what it is. They decide what licenses count as open. Apache 2.0 is open, some other licenses aren't. I actually think it's a red herring to just call something open based on an open license. I don't much care actually how exactly it is licensed, if I can audit it, if I can look into it, if I can use your model at least to understand it better. In fact, there have been some parties that have been working hard to develop responsible licenses. The Rails license is a beautiful example from, I think, Hugging Face, among other parties. I think that's a very important license for enforcing a form of accountability. And that, to me, is more important than just putting it out there openly for everyone to use or indeed abuse. So in that sense, openness in terms of licenses is maybe less key. The final thing I promised to talk about, that's the openness of reinforcement learning data. So I picked on Meta earlier on, right, about their 1 million instructions that we don't know what's in there. I think in general, what makes these models behave surprisingly, fluidly, interactively, so what makes them simulate human interaction so well is that reinforcement learning with human feedback, or its more recent versions like DPO and SFT. Don't worry about the technical terms if you don't know them. But a lot of that is due to this reinforcement learning data. We'd like to know what's in there. And once again, we don't need to download it, would be nice, but at least we must know what you did to your model. So picking once again on Meta, just because it's easy, so that I don't need to introduce many different examples. In those 1 million instructions, surely there are safety guidelines and guardrails that try to keep the model from outputting stuff that is all too racist or sexist and so on. And who would object to that? But who is to say whether in those same 1 million guidelines are also not things like subtle framings of a political nature, or indeed, why not? Who works with Meta? Who are their partners? Maybe their model is slightly more positive about those companies than others. The point is, we don't know, and we can't even check. I would love, for instance, AI forensics to be able to look into that, because I think we need to know for a model that is as widely used as Llama by Meta. So those are the 3 points regarding the differentiatedness of openness that I wanted to make.
Great. And you mentioned OpenRail, and I do want to turn to Lucy and hear about some of the best practices that are coming out of the open source community right now, especially with relation to evaluation and research.
Yeah, I'm really sorry. Like, with me, you always have to make this mental gymnastics, because we talk a lot about the large models, like this small 3-4 models that are dominating supposedly the market. And we talk, or when I talk in Hugging Face terms, when we talk about AI, we talk about the whole AI landscape, right? We have 600,000 public models at the moment of varying degrees of openness, to be fair, but open. Nevertheless, you can download them, you can test them, you can work with them. We have a huge amount, I haven't checked the numbers recently, I'm very sorry about that. We have a huge amount of data sets the same way that you can use. And while this is all extremely important work, I just want to stress the fact that when I talk now about the models or the best practices that we've found that worked for us, that we talk about this huge landscape, and I think that is really important to keep in mind, because if it works for 600,000 open models or 1 million now models on Hugging Face, why wouldn't it work for those those few providers of those very large models, right? So one of the things that I think we've pushed a lot and that has worked really well is this documentation, the transparency in terms of models as well as data sets. So we have those data set cards and model cards where the owners or the uploaders of the data sets and models document. We provide a template for that. People fill in that template to varying degrees. I think this is an interesting area of study at the moment also to like what works well, what do people fill in and so on. But it gives a base basically to read and understand not only what is in the data set or what's the model trained on and trained for, but also what was the intent, what's the bias, what was it evaluated for and with, what metrics were applied already to the data sets. There's a very thorough documentation, and I think I come from a very like academic background of machine learning, and I think seeing that it's often that smaller models, especially that come from the academic world, that then are widely reused, people don't necessarily maintain them much. So those documentations have a very crucial point here as well, where like we know how the things were done, who done it, who do I contact, and so on. Another thing that happens on Hugging Face that I think is really interesting with a focus on evaluation of models is that we also have leaderboards, not the open leaderboard that Mark was presenting, but leaderboards based on evaluation metrics. So the OpenLLM leaderboard, for example, I just suggest to have a look at this. I think it's really interesting. Those are also community contributed. So this enables the community to say, there's this metric that I really, really care about. Let's say hate speech metrics, right? I can build a leaderboard for that and compare the different Hugging Face models as in like how well do they perform on that thing that is really important to me and my community when I deploy a model in that context. So I think this like contextualization of the leaderboards is extremely interesting. Generally, of course, because there is this like large open source community behind Hugging Face, there's a lot of self-governance happening. And I think this, to me, is something that I really love because, as I said, I come from an ML background, but I also come from a very like open source community background. I find it really fascinating and cool to see that there's a community of AI model developers who keep each other in check, but also who report problems with models, who check the models, who test them. And I think this is a very approachable way, and I think this is a really big argument for open source, because as non-technical people, we can only do that much. Like, there's that much red teaming, that much evaluation we can do, but someone has to download the model and run it and see how does it behave? What happens if I tweak that hyperparameter? Does it still have that intended outcome? What if the reinforcement learning has information that it shouldn't have, and so on. So I think this like investing in a community that looks into that, fostering that open source community around ML and AI is irreplaceable. It makes voices heard, and it is especially makes the model developers a lot more accountable compared to closed source access, where even if I find a problem, I report it, and then who listens to me if I'm a single person in a not even affiliated with an NGO, right? With some small university somewhere that, you know, doesn't give me a big voice. I think one of the challenges relating to that for the open source community for a very long time was the lack of resources. So we can't compete as much, especially if now I'm Hugging Face, so we can, but you know, if you don't have the resources, you can't really provide the same models, the same kind of insight, the same kind of data scraping. And so there is now this, from Hugging Face, the Zero GPU initiatives that ensures wider access, that allows developers to test their models, to deploy models in a very in a very interesting way, also referring to that. It's maybe a bit technical, but I think it's a really important initiative to enable open source developers to actually run their models and work with them.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's really, the term gymnastics actually stuck with me also because I think we are talking about a lot of different models right now. We're also doing the same thing with researchers, right? Like you talk about community, which I think is a really useful way of talking about scrutiny. Nick, the research that you've done is on a certain type of researcher, although I think you're also mapping different types of researchers there. So could you talk a little bit more now about the challenges that researchers are facing looking into these formalized programs, and also even a little bit about who are the researchers, what kind of researchers are they?
So, so we interviewed quite a few AI safety researchers, so people who, again, are the kinds of people that would participate in these in the formalized programs such as those by OpenAI. And so these are experts in a variety of fields, but all kind of like software experts, AI experts. And what we found, we wanted to learn a little bit more about the issues that they face trying to gain access to these programs, to kind of highlight the kind of uneven, let's say, access playing field in the market. So we found a few things. I mentioned the selection processes for those, for programs like OpenAI's external research program. We found that the selection process wasn't really independent, is quite opaque, quite hard for outsiders to get a view into. Basically, these companies are essentially gatekeepers to the models that they are putting out, right? So they get to choose who they work with, right? And that also means that they can prioritize the research that aligns with their priorities the most. So we found, for instance, that the red teaming of GPT-4, for instance, was biased towards English-speaking researchers from North American universities. We also found that access to OpenAI employees kind of made it easier to access programs. And overall, like most of these companies dedicate few resources to processing applications for external researchers, which means that there are huge backlogs. Then there's the issue of insufficient levels of information access, which Mark touched on as well. So the amount of data that you can get access to, the types of information that you can access, obviously impacts your research scope. It impacts the kind of things that you can research. A very obvious thing is model versions. So if you don't have access to a stable version of the model, you won't have like a stable basis for research, right? So you'll be giving the same prompt for a whole week to a model, and it'll give you the same thing. And from one day to the next, that changes because they've added a filter or something like that. That means that like you don't really have a constant in your research that you can kind of base your writing on, base your analysis on. So here, Cohere, OpenAI, and Google apparently do relatively well. But the others don't really, which again hinders research reproducibility as well. Lack of access to training data, we've already touched upon that, but like here maybe I can touch on why it's difficult to get access to training data. And a lot of it has to do with copyright issues, obviously. So if it's, obviously if you're scraping data from the internet, you might get copyrighted materials, and maybe you might not want people to know that or know the full extent of that. There's usage data, how people use your platform, your model, your API, the sort of trends in user behavior. Very basic thing, but here privacy concerns get in the way because there's a strong expectation that your prompts will remain private, right? It's not like posts on social media where if you're posting it like on your profile, there's, you can expect people to see it, right? But if you're just talking to ChatGPT, that's a conversation between you and the model, which now sounds like Scarlett Johansson, so that helps as well, I hear. I mentioned earlier, like public access is rate limited, API access can be quite expensive, which creates these inequitable barriers to entry. It means that like you're more able to do research if you have access to a subsidized program by one of the companies, or if you have external funding, which again can lead a kind of bias towards research on certain issues. And a big problem is what Buza was touching on earlier, which has to do with the enforcement processes that companies have with regards to research and the usage of their platform in general. So your goal as a safety researcher, including an external safety researcher, is to test the boundaries of the program, right, of the model, right? So all these models have usage policies. They have filters to prevent the output of illegal material, of harmful material. And your goal as a researcher is to test the model. So try to make it give you illegal material, illegal content, harmful content. The issue here is that most of these companies don't have like a safe harbor for external researchers. So it means that you could be trying to generate problematic content with these models, and then your account gets suspended, right? Because you're breaching the policy. So we found that Meta and Anthropic have a safe harbor that only applies to security research. OpenAI is a little broader. They have a safe harbor for security and academic research related to model safety. And meanwhile, Google's Gemini, Inflection, and Midjourney have no safe harbor. So unless you work directly with the company, the chances are that your research accounts will be, the accounts that you're using for research will be terminated or higher. Along with that, there's not full transparency in regards to like how these companies enforce their usage policies with regards to safety research, external safety research. Yeah, so these are the main things that we found. I think I'll stop there.
Yeah. Booza, I hope you wrote down the programs with Safe Harbor, because I think Scarlett Johansson and AI forensics are going to have a great study. But actually, Nick, I'm going to come back to you on this last question I want to ask. And I do want to save time for audience questions as well. But this is Brussels. We should talk about policy. We're going to fix everything with policy. So we have the DSA now. We have kind of the Delegated Act. And some of that regime is still being built, right? We also have transparency obligations, also kind of security, red teaming type obligations in the AI Act as well. And we have also national institutes. So Nick, tell us, what are some of the opportunities and what are the ambiguities around AI models and access under the DSA and the AI Act?
Right. So I'll touch on the AI Act first, which I'm sure if you didn't know about the AI Act, everyone must be an expert by now. It's day 2. So the AI Act has these provisions that have to do with general purpose AI models. Basically, the providers of these models will have to provide, so there's a certain level of transparency. So here we're looking at technical documentation, including with regards to training, testing, a summary about the contents used for the training of the model, so not releasing the training data itself, but like a description of the training data. And then if you're a general purpose AI model with systemic risk, there's a little bit more. You have to provide information on model evaluation, and you have to assess and mitigate possible systemic risks, including their sources, and then you have to document these risks and report to the AI office and national authorities about serious incidents. So all of this, basically, I mean, it's more transparency, but it falls short of creating a framework that promotes external research into general purpose AI models. So we've got some like delegated acts on the AI Act that are coming out that could, that could maybe help, with some provisions that have to do with external researchers, but like that's essentially not the goal of the AI Act as it's written right now. So therefore it looks like the DSA, which was written and mostly finalized before ChatGPT became like a popular thing that everyone's using. The DSA is the tool that will be most useful for external researchers when it comes to external safety research of foundation models, generative AI models. So here, Article 40 is the big one, which kind of creates this structured researcher access initiative to enable researchers to request a wide range of platform data to conduct research on systemic risks. It includes like a detailed way in how researchers are vetted, selected, and so on. The problem here is that the application of the DSA depends on the design of the products in question. So in short, it basically only applies to very large online platforms and very large online search engines. What are we talking about? 45 million users. You have to be a search engine or you have to be an online platform. So the issue here is that these definitions don't really align perfectly with the way in which the most popular models on the market right now are structured. So for example, if you're looking at, it looks like the most likely option here is that the models that can also be technically considered search engines will fall within the scope of Article 40 of the DSA. So here we're looking at Bard, Bing, and ChatGPT in some instances. So for instance, the premium version of ChatGPT draws data from the web directly to answer questions. So it can technically be considered a search engine, right? It's easier to argue that it's a search engine. So assuming it has 45 million users, then it falls within the scope. Bing, we already know. So Bing, the search engine, is a very large search engine, right? It has 45 million users. Therefore, Bing Chat, because it's integrated within Bing, is likely also a very large search engine. Therefore, falls within the scope of Article 40 DSA. Probably.
I might stop you there for a second,
Yeah.
but it sounds like we're going to have maybe a lot of research on Bing and Gemini.
Well, one last thing I'll say is that this basically, it's most likely for the text generation ones, but for the image generation, video generation, voice generation, it's basically totally unclear. Okay. It's pretty unlikely that Article 40 would apply.
Okay. So we'll look forward to future policy. Buza, I would love to understand kind of what would be AI forensics' dream access regime, right? I know you're also working with Article 40 and will continue to do that, but what would you and AI forensics really like to have more formally mandated? And also, have you discussed any of that with companies directly?
I'm going to try to not to talk about Bing, but I'm tempted because there's a recent, well, all that we're talking about is actually happening, and we're just seeing, how things are going to work as we speak. Again, if I take that example, what we do, we don't have access to the information that I talked about that help us understand basically how the model works, what is the interaction between the large language model and the search engine and so on and so forth. And what we do, we collect data within our own means, analyze it, put it out, and then talk to the policymakers. And this question of whether this could be, Bing Chat or Microsoft Copilot could be held accountable under the DSA has been also a big question mark for us. But at the beginning of the year with Algorithm Watch, we tried to test the Article 40 actually, because we do this research, but at the same time, we have no knowledge of how people use the platform or the chatbot or not. What kind of questions do they ask, and so on and so forth. So it is also something that we advocated for in our feedback for election integrity guidelines that were published, recently. Having something like maybe Google Trends for, chatbots that are widely used could be also maybe helpful for researchers to understand how people interact with these systems, what they use it for. Do they know about, in which cases they can be reliable, helpful, or not at all? So that's one thing. So the test of Article 40 didn't work because we just see that digital service coordinators are being, appointed right now in France, for example, or different dates in different countries. They were also I think, not very knowledgeable about how to process these requests. I think the question of, asking for proportionate data and your capacity as, let's say, a researcher, academic, affiliated to academia or not, or civil society, to, in terms of data security, seems to be also an important concern. But last Friday, we have seen that the Commission requested for information from Bing, including its AI services, because in the election integrity guidelines as well, if I'm not wrong, it says that they need to also, mitigate the risks that are stemming from part of their services that are integrated, in this case, for example, this very large online search engine that has been designated as such. So we're not going to probably have access to the information that they will hopefully provide within the next week or so, but we will be able to, for example, observe whether this is going to lead to a formal proceeding, on which grounds and how.
Yeah, and I think the delegated act will also be critical also for understanding more of this. So if I could ask Lucy and Mark both briefly, so we can also leave time for questions, maybe in a couple of minutes, to maybe first turning to you, Lucy. What would Hugging Face like to see in the form of regulation, or like to avoid also in the form of regulation?
In the fear of repeating myself, we have a lot of small models and small model developers, and I think that the conversation and policy focus a lot around big models, and this actually can have a really detrimental impact, I think, where we create regulation that is very easy to do for those that develop very large closed-sourced models, but creates a fear in publishing and distributing models as well as data sets. And I think this would be a stage that we should be very wary of. So, for example, if we look at, I love in the policy world that you can throw out acronyms and people just yeah, totally understand that. Anyway, so given for example, the TDM opt-out, right? When we discuss about what does that mean for data sets. So in Hugging Face, we have an option, we have some implementation of what a TDM opt-out could look like. We're working with spawning AI, so there's an option to opt out from training data on our platform. But the problem becomes, if we are not careful, we will only penalize the data sets that do happen to be in broad daylight, right? And not the ones that are closed behind doors. And I think this is something that we should be really careful when we are doing policy and when we're pushing for regulations. I think a lot of things happen in the open source world already that would be really helpful for the regulators to look towards. As I said, there's transparency of datasets and models, this model and dataset card. There's the engagement with the actual users and forms of reporting where people are actually heard and directly communicate with model developers, not only if they happen to take their problems to the press. There's accountability mechanisms, which we would like to see more for also the larger AI developers, certifications, audits, assessments, so democratizing also this idea of accountability. And as the Bruce and Nick already said, I think this broad access for users and researchers is really crucial, and that is happening on open source, and I think that should happen a lot more for closed source models, so we actually understand what users are interacting with and where problems can arise.
So tacking onto that, actually, we in our leaderboard, we see smaller groups and smaller models actually being the most open. So clearly it can be done. There isn't a good reason that the bigger ones aren't doing it well. Of course, we know there is a good reason for them, their legal exposure mostly, but it can be done in any case. And that's what legislation should then probably also focus on. So in our work, we've identified a big trend, especially among the so-called open models and the larger corporations. They do something called open washing, which is to collect brownie points for openness without actually disclosing the critical information on training and fine-tuning and so on, which allows you then to escape the scrutiny, the legal and the scientific scrutiny, and that's a great way for these corporations to claim openness, but it also sucks up the oxygen out of the open source ecosystem, because if Meta gets away with just claiming or co-opting the term open source, as they have clearly tried to do very systematically across the board since last year, if they get to indeed claim open source status without being open source in any true sense of the word at all, it just makes it harder for the players who really do try to do nice work and good work in this space to actually continue that work. So this is a risk of open washing. That risk is actually compounded by an interesting fact about the EU AI Act. I'm very thankful to Nick for introducing us to this, or at least summarizing and refreshing our memory. Now, there's one interesting exemption in the EU AI Act as it is now, actually, which is for open source models. The term open source actually is given legal weight in the EU AI Act. And, you know, we now can see suddenly a big reason, of course, that Meta might be wanting to claim open source status, because that might also then allow them to apply for this exemption. What is the exemption about? About exactly the kind of transparency and detailed information about issues like training data and fine-tuning methods that they would otherwise be subjected to. So essentially, by claiming to be open or by counting as open, you might get away with not having all those onerous requirements. That would be great, of course. That's the game that they are playing. They're playing that game with loads of money. We're in Brussels here. Just last week, it became known that Meta is investing at least 8 million yearly in its lobbying efforts specifically for the digital world here in Brussels. And so some of that lobbying money clearly went into also shaping what the EU AI Act is becoming. There are ways out. We sketch some of them in our paper. There's a paper that you can find if you go to this openness index at Opening Up ChatGPT. And one way out, we think, is to really be very sharp for the EU AI office that is to be instituted, and for the template that that very office is actually gonna draw up. That is going to specify exactly what counts as open and which forms of disclosure you should be giving, even if you count as open. So I think that is where our efforts must be focused, because surely that's where the efforts of the lobbyists are focused right now.
Great. Thank you for that. I'd love to open it up for questions at this point. I think there's also someone with a microphone that can go around because this is being recorded.
Hi, I have two questions. Question one on the status of explainable AI or XAI, and how having safety research or research into the forensics of what makes a model, or how machine learning gets to a certain situation, how do you guys see your work as proceeding towards the goal of explainable AI? Is that goal even a feasible goal, or is it just theory or a red herring? Is it even practical? I just would love to hear your thoughts on this. And the second question is, so far in the panel we were talking about transparency and accountability in terms of all of you as researchers and people who are specifically researching into this. Now, how do you guys think about translating the work that you guys do into what ordinary users need? Because ultimately, I think, yes, it is true that at least people in your places should understand, people outside a company should understand how that model works, but ultimately this all effort, some of it should be in aid of the fact that people otherwise just have no concept of what's going on there. And is there an idea of translating the work you guys do for ordinary users?
I don't know if one of our panelists wants to take the first question and then one take the second, and then we move on. Okay, and what with the first? Or
I can also say something to the second thing.
Or we can just do the second for now, yeah. Go ahead, Buze, maybe.
Okay.
Okay, I'm trying to remember. Accountability, transparency. Yeah, what about the people? Actually, to me as well, I'm not coming from a technical background, and I'm not part of the technical team at AI Forensics who conducts this research. So I'm a bit like you. So I'm like, okay, what do you guys do? What does this mean? How do you actually do that? And what I learned recently is that although it might sound a little bit complicated from the outside, sometimes the research also is not that complicated. You do also some like, small-scale manual research where our dear researcher, for example, Salvatore, watches videos about suicide in order to see, whether TikTok and to what extent TikTok pushes ideas or content about self-harm and suicide to teenage users in different parts of the world. And I think people already do this. Some media studies researchers, I think, refer to that like algo speak, algorithmic folklore. But I also see, for example, a lot of requests by journalists who are trying to test and try themselves, putting aside all these maybe like social media influencers or like marketing agencies on TikTok or like Instagram that are telling you, oh, the platform changed this feature and affordance. This is what you can do to make your... So I believe we are already like in our individual capacity trying to make sense of what is going on, like test and sometimes manipulate the quote-unquote algorithm. And for me, making that accessible is kind of tying this personal experience and stories that where you feel very isolated and secluded because this only you and your phone with larger scale observation, and also bringing the policy and policy enforcement elements there so that the mechanism actually works.
Okay, I'll just like merge a little bit the two questions. So I think on the state of explainable AI, I think there's a lot of stuff happening that like I can go into unnecessary technical details, but I'll skip that a little bit because I don't want you to fall asleep right now. But I think one of the important thing is that we need openness of models and data to do that kind of research, right? And I mean, we don't, in Hugging Face, we don't focus on that research. I think it's probably in the company somewhere happening, but I think that's something that's very well reliant on universities, and I think that's where research institutes come in and do really, really good and cool work. And I do think that is required even for like large closed-sourced models. Understanding why a model does a certain decision will always be a good thing to have. Whether you expose that to users is another question. And again, for that we would need openness of data, because otherwise the only thing we will ever be able to do is red teaming, right? To sit a bunch of people in front of the computer and try asking questions. And I think Nick made a very good point about like that then becomes the decision of the company who gets to do that kind of research, right? I think another example I just wanted to give of like how can you translate something like this to a user is the star coder that we have on Hugging Face. It's a model that does code completion. So when you're writing programming code, it completes the code. And I think one of the cool aspects we have of that, because it's all open source and the data is all open source, that's also where you can opt out from the data, by the way, on the side, but is that we can attribute data back to the user that wrote that data in the first place. And I think this is a really cool and functional thing to have. And I think that should be something we encourage at large, to understand provenance and source of information. Yeah. For various reasons, but.
Cornelia, did you still? Cornelia, maybe, and then. Oh, sorry.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for this very insightful discussion. My name is Imelda. I'm from Kenya, and I'm in research and advocacy for policy aligning. I have one question for you. Are there African-based models that you have analyzed, and if so, do they reflect certain levels of transparency and accountability? Thank you.
Should I say something again to that? Okay, I'm sorry. I mean, since we have a lot of models, I know about a lot of initiatives. I think one of the big initiatives coming for African languages is Masakane. I don't know if you're aware of that. It's a really cool initiative of different communities on the African continent at large that work together on their native languages, providing models and data sets. This is all open. A lot of this is also happening on Hugging Face. It also happens independent of us, so we are not that directly involved. I think there's some overlap naturally because we're moving in the same space. I think there's a lot of cool work on like differences in values across different models based on the training data. I don't think there's anything specifically for the African language data set trained models yet. But I think that's a really cool research gap to work on.
I think I'm the next. Hope this works. So first of all, congratulations to Mozilla for this absolutely fascinating panel and to all the speakers as well. I have a question to Mark specifically. Your take on openness is really interesting, and for a while in the policy sphere, it has died down a little bit. There was this clear openness versus safety dispute, tension, and I'd like to hear a little bit, maybe also from Hugging Face, how you think this has evolved, whether this has died down a little bit, and then maybe also literally, maybe for the other two panelists, more the second question around systemic risks in the AI Act, and whether the mitigations that are put forward there, aren't they actually applicable to all models or should be applicable to all models, and how you think about the sort of this threshold, I'm not talking about the flops, just to have like a high impact threshold for mitigation of risks, or whether there needs to be more involvement around thinking about mitigations more generally. It's maybe a little bit beyond transparency and accountability, but if it's sort of well in there too.
Yeah, we'll probably have time for maybe one more question after that because we have 5 minutes left.
Since you started with me, I'll try to be very brief. Openness versus safety. I think it's actually a false dichotomy. Corporate entities have been hand-waving at AI safety mainly as a reason to just keep their system specifications under wraps, while I think that's just an attempt to obscure the clear and present harms that their models that are already available are already doing in the world. So I think there's just too much harm already happening with whatever is available for them to complain about. Ooh, we can't open up our stuff. Then what the game they play actually is rhetorically interesting. I'm a linguist, so I look at that too. So what they tend to do is they tend to take open source as one of two extremes. One is radical openness. Oh, we must open up everything. We must give all our data to you. Surely we can't do that. The alternative they pose for that is on the other end, which I call homeopathic openness. So they just open their model weights. That's the most inscrutable part of any LLM, the model weights. That is what they are prepared to share with us. That's what Gemma does, what Mistral does, what Meta does. That's meaningless openness. In between radical and homeopathic openness, we place meaningful openness. It doesn't need to be open across the board, but it does need to be meaningful, auditable, researchable, and understandable to the public.
Yeah, about the AI Act, systemic risks in the AI Act, and the question of should those provisions apply to all models? Should we have more provisions?
They have a
5 minutes, 3 minutes?
Two, I think two.
2 minutes. I mean, very quickly, I mean, there's, in practice, not that much, like the provisions on general purpose AIs with systemic risk in the AI Act. I mean, it's very light touch, right? So, I mean, in practice, how much will it have of an impact on actual systemic risks caused by general purpose AI? I mean, I think part of the issue is that the notion of general purpose AI was like tacked on at the very end of the process, right? So what we have is, I think, something that's ends up being a little inadequate because I think most policymakers didn't have a full understanding of how we should deal with systemic risks from general purpose AI, right? And I think it's something that like we're still battling with, right? Because if you think about the problem of very quickly, the problem of making your model, for instance, if you make your model open to a good extent, right? It's a lot easier to remove safeguards applied to the model, right? So you can have a model that's put on the market and maybe has no systemic risks. It reaches the threshold, right? And at the point of release, you could say, okay, I think this is safe. You can't generate any child sexual abuse with it. You can't generate any illegal content, right? And then someone takes that model, manages to remove all the safeguards, and you have systemic risks once again. The AI Act doesn't really talk about this problem, doesn't really tackle this issue properly. So I think there's more work to be done, in short.
Great. I think we have 1 minute, so I think can we take one question? Are you guys really into the topic? Because then we can really push it to the end. Okay, great. Go ahead, please, yeah. Oh, I'm so sorry. I've done that twice. My vision is really not please.
So, thank you for the presentation. My name is Marinos Manuel Kalpakos. I'm a lawyer and doctoral researcher for the University of Luxembourg. I wanted to ask a question to Mark specifically with regards to opening the training data set. You mentioned to the you made a mention to the OpenAI versus New York Times case, which was a copyright infringement case. However, having an open training data set may have prevented that, but what if sensitive data are involved in more industry-specific LLMs, such as Bloomberg GPT, for example, in financial services, or an AI that makes cancer diagnosis? Wouldn't that be a dilemma between transparency and privacy?
It is, yes. That's why we advocate for not necessarily opening up all the data, giving it to us literally, but at least telling us what's in there. So, tell us which books went in there, what data went into the training, without actually necessarily sharing this, is already better than doing nothing.
Great. All right. We are at time. So I think with that, I'll just thank our panel very much for joining us for this topic, to be continued. Thank you so much.